little button with an arrow on it. It always seems to change places.
I know, it's always what's the word? I haven't done this for it's been a while since I've put stuff taught on Teams, so this is where I can't find anything. Oh yeah, it's all there, don't worry. Oh no, it's not. Oh yes, it is. Oh yes. Hopefully. I remember this is a sort of gigantic file, so it may take another year to load.
Nothing's showing up yet, but
yeah, it's getting there. It'll be there eventually. It's a sort of snail. It's a bit of a snail mail.
Fantastic. Great. I'll introduce you then, Julie, and then I'll turn off, and then you can crack on. So yeah, welcome everyone to our third panel of the day, networking. So we're gonna, first up, we've got Julie, who is a PhD candidate from Queen Mary University in London. Now, Julie's research examines the lives of 3 generations of aristocratic women in the 15th century, looking at Alice Montagu, Countess of Salisbury, Catherine Neville, Baroness of Hastings, and Cecily Bonville, Marchioness of Dorset. Today, Julie's going to be focusing on the early family network of Alice Montagu. And yeah, thank you very much for coming, Julie. And I will mute myself and you can give our presentation. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me. And I'm going to take us back now into the 15th century, in fact, way back into the 15th century, and a lot further into the 15th century than I actually intended when I first put my proposal together. But that's the way that PhDs go. So we're going to have a look at a woman who was very highly regarded in the middle of the 15th century. And she comes from quite an unusual background. She's one of these people that have quite a mixed background. She's not just an aristocrat. She's actually related to quite a few different families and that were important for various reasons in the 15th century. So I was trying to look at some sort of ideas of around the topic, what I was going to look at. So what were the importance of her maternal, paternal family networks? Because I feel a lot of time and a lot of the studies that I've read on the 15th century seem to neglect the role that women have in creating networks, particularly in the Wars of the Roses, which is the part that I study quite intensely. So we're going to have a look at how much it impacted on her social status, what's her significance of her relationship to the monarchy, and in a period of sort of political instability, this is very crucial, I think. And as we'll see, as the monarchy changes and different regimes come in, your closeness or far to those monarchs does have quite an impact on how well your family does, and how does her family benefit from their connections with the London merchant community. So looking at Alice, I've done this diagram, which I hope will give you an idea of the sorts of things that she was related to. So starting then with Alice herself, she was the only surviving daughter of her parents. Her father was the Earl of Salisbury, and her mother was from a very highly regarded family called the Hollands. She was probably, we think, born in about 1407, and she was married at 14 to a distant relative called Richard Neville. They had 12 children together, and one of her sons was extremely famous and played a very, very prominent part in the Wars of the Roses. His name was Warwick the Kingmaker, although she herself didn't shy of her involvement in the conflict, and she was actually one of the, I think, 4 women to be attainted by Parliament in this period. And in fact, her attainder in Parliament in 1459 saw her as being one of the instigators of the revival of the Wars of the Roses in 1459. As a result of her attainder, which would have resulted in her being executed, I think burnt at the stake was the preferred method for female traitors. She went into exile in Ireland and came back, but then massive family disaster at the Battle of Wakefield in 1460, which saw the death of her son and her husband, as well as her and by 1461 her nephew Edward IV was crowned and restored her family's lands and titles. And possibly we think she died about a year later. Again, we're not very clear. Her background is really important because it gives her such a diverse network. It gives her access to people who are the main participants in the political events, and also gives her access to resources, particularly money resources and trade resources, that perhaps some of the other aristocrats at the period didn't have. She's closely connected with all the monarchs. She is related to all of them to a varying degree, as we will see. She's also related to quite a few of the London merchants, the important London merchants, including the Chaucers. You may have heard of them. And these networks enabled her to develop very strong social bonds and have lots of influence and agency in quite a lot of context. So I'm going to start with her royal connections. And she was, as I said earlier, connected to most of the monarchs of the time. And it depended really to which regime was in power as to how close she was to them. Initially, the King Richard, who had actually died probably a couple of years before she was born, was actually very close. It was her great uncle, her mother's uncle, in fact, and that enabled her mother's family, the Hollands, to do very, very well out of this. And one of the things I've sort of looked at is that the kings at this point were very close to the aristocracy. For the first time since, I think, 1016, the kings of England had English aristocratic mothers. Now, this is very unusual. I'll say it's most of the kings of England were related on the maternal side to people from overseas, and this obviously limits the extent of patronage and access to patronage for some of the aristocracy. But for the monarchs, actually, in fact, between 1377 and 1553, most of them, apart from Henry VI, and he's his exception, again, most of them had mothers who were English aristocrats. So this facilitated the development of a much wider sphere of royal influence among the aristocracy and enabled these quite extensive reciprocal relationships. And it also enabled these aristocrats to be quite highly favoured. Alice's Holland relatives were actually promoted to dukedoms by their very generous relative Richard II. However, Richard was deposed in 1399 and their dukedoms were taken away from them. They did try and get them back in a rising in 1400, but sadly it went horribly wrong, and their lands and titles were actually taken away from them, and in one case not given back for another 60 years. So the family were in quite a difficult situation when Alice was born. Her father was very young. He was only probably about 19 years old. His father had lost his lands due to his rebellion against Henry IV, and he tried desperately to rehabilitate the family. And under Henry IV, that didn't go particularly well. Henry IV did not restore them fully to their lands. It got slightly better under Henry V, because she was actually more closely related to Henry V, and he referred to her mother as his kinswoman in documents. But as the regimes change, she gets closer and closer to, the royals, and is able to sort of utilise quite a lot of royal patronage. So going on to her parents, who are actually aristocrats, there's a picture from the Salisbury roll, not actually realistic, not taken from life, but actually showing her parents and depicting them and their aristocratic connections. So you can see them with their coats of arms. Dad's got his Montagu arms and the Monthermer arms, and his her mother, Eleanor Holland, has got these sort of royal arms that came from her ancestry, descendant of Edward I. So these were very, very important to the family, and this roll was actually produced probably in about 1460s to show how far they'd come by this stage. So Alice was actually from the Montagu family. They were barons originally, then they became Earls of Salisbury due to their royal service. And this continued under Alice, and in fact her two of her sons became very, very important. One becomes Earl of Warwick and Earl of Salisbury, and another of her sons becomes Marquess. So they become very, very high status in the middle of the 15th century. They play their roles as royal servants and, rose rapidly through the ranks. And then just before Richard II's death in 1499, the Montagues allied with the Hollands and they married off two of their kids. So John Montagu's son Thomas, who was 12, was married off to Thomas Holland's daughter, Eleanor, who was also 12. And these two later become the sort of sole heirs and heiresses of their aristocratic family. So Eleanor has extensive royal connections as well. She was very closely related to Richard II. She was actually his niece, and she had 5 sisters and 2 sons. Her 2 brothers. Her 2 brothers died without children, which led to her and her remaining sisters becoming their heiresses, which gave them quite a lot of landed resources. And in fact, Eleanor's wealth was actually much more prestigious and much more extensive than that of her husband's. However, as she was married to Thomas claimed control of her lands, and as they had a child together, by a law which was called the Curse of England, Thomas controlled her lands and estates even after her death. And Eleanor was also quite well connected because one of her ancestors were the Fitzalans, and they were incredibly wealthy. And in fact, Eleanor's Holland's grandfather left something like £70,000 in his will in 1376. It's pretty impossible to put that into any sort of sensible, what it would be in modern terms, but it was actually equivalent to an annual salary to employ 10,000 labourers. So incredibly wealthy people, and this land and status, continues to descend through the family and enrich subsequent members. And then the last part of Alice's connections, which was probably something that wasn't emphasised by the family, was her ties with the London merchants. So Alice's father, Thomas, was the product of the marriage of John Montagu, Earl of Salisbury, with a woman called Maud Francis. And Maud was actually the daughter of a former Lord Mayor of London. And this marriage has been sort of described as being a bit of a plebeian marriage. There were reasons for the Montagues perhaps not marrying into the aristocracy at the time, as there was a bit of a dispute between the family. That John Montagu was actually from a younger branch of the family. His uncle was originally the Earl of Salisbury, but his uncle was destined to die childless and wasn't very happy with his relatives inheriting the earldom, so he was actually giving away land and setting up quite a lot of disputes within them. So John Montagu marries this woman called Maud. Frances, she's been married twice before. She was probably married as a child to another wealthy London merchant. She was also, after his death, she married a bit higher up. She married a member of the gentry, a man called Sir Alan Buxhill. He was a very prestigious royal servant. And then on Alan's death, she married John Montagu, and their son Thomas was able to survive after the disgrace of his father because his mother's land was sufficient to give him some sort of income. So really, you know, Alice has quite a mixed background, and I think, you know, it doesn't seem to be a conventional pattern for many aristocrats at the time. And added to this, when Alice's mother died, her father remarried. At this point, his family was still in a bit of disgrace. So he marries a woman who is actually a member of the merchant class, a woman whose name is Alice Chaucer, and she's actually the granddaughter of Geoffrey Chaucer, the poet. And this gives him quite a lot of connections because Alice Chaucer was also related through her grandmother, whose sister married John of Gaunt, and they were actually the parents of the Beaufort family. So there's some quite interesting sort of interlinks that I discovered when I was looking into the family. Ultimately, I think what this does is that these family networks become very, very important for Alice's prosperity. They give her links to landed wealth, but they also give her links to ready cash. It enables Alice to sort of negotiate the very unstable political system that she finds herself in the 15th century. It helps her when, you know, she's not that close to the monarchy, when, you know, she's able to, through her links with the merchants, she's able to, you know, survive. She's able to utilize a very extensive network that helps her, particularly when she has to leave the country. She has to board a ship and go off to Ireland. It also gives her links with all the main participants in the political events of the 15th century, and it enables her to act as a conduit to the kings of the period, and also have access to the merchants and the wider aristocracy. So I think this really gives her quite a lot of agency at the time, and perhaps explains why she was, of all the aristocratic women in the 15th century, why she was actually singled out and declared to be a traitor and, you know, an instigator of treason against the king. So I'm going to leave it there for now. There's lots of bits and pieces that I have to research and have to work on to sort of put a bit more flesh on the bones here, but I just wanted to give you a sort of brief outline of what I've been researching in the initial stages of my PhD. So thank you very much for listening, and if you have any questions, please either put them in the chat box or talk to us later, or get in touch. You know, I think the bio links are on the main site, so if you think of something later, please just drop me an email. It'd be lovely to hear from you. So thank you very much to Amy and Johanna for inviting me, and look forward to hearing the rest of the conference. Thank you.